Hi, everyone. I'm Rahul Yates, founder and executive director of HumSub GlobalTEEN, an organization dedicated to raising awareness and building a community for multiracial and multicultural teens. Today, I'm so excited to have a discussion with Dr. Jennifer Noble about growing up mixed race, the intersection of mixed race and mental health, and advice for multiracial teens. Before we start, please remember to follow at HumSub GlobalTEEN and at Dr. Jen Psych on all social media platforms. So our first question, could you just introduce yourself, how you identify as, and what you currently do?
Sure. So, well, you said my name, so it's Dr. Jennifer Noble. And how I identify as I change the order sometimes, but I definitely identify as an African American, Sri Lankan Tamil woman, California native. I usually add that in there too. And then you said, what do I do, right? Yeah, so what I do is I am a psychologist by trade. So I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and I have a private practice in Southern California. And then I have a coaching arm of my business, which is dedicated to the parents of mixed race kids specifically. And so within that, I've started I guess what you'd call like a coaching sort of community for parents, and it's called the Mixed Life Academy. So it's any parent with mixed race kids, they can come and get sort of advice and guidance and coaching and education from me about how to, best meet the needs of their mixed race kid. And then within my private practice, I focus a lot on teens. So I work with a lot of different teens, whether they're monoracial, mixed race, on any issue that's related to teens. And of course, I interact with their parents as well. And then besides that, I do teach at the community college level. So I teach different psychology courses, and I enjoy that as well. And yeah, the other things I do is, I don't know, I enjoy good food and dancing and music and things like that.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. And so could you talk about your experience growing up mixed? And did you have any specific experiences that you think really stand out and might embody the mixed experience or anything like that?
Yeah, well, I was thinking, you know, overall, I'd have to say growing up mixed race for me was relatively uneventful. I didn't have any major events that were really related specifically to being mixed race. But what I usually, say about that is I think it's because the world sort of saw me as one thing. And only when I got a little bit older, then people would say, "Hey, are you this or what are you?" And da da da. So when I was younger, I think kind of through elementary school and some of middle school, most people weren't thinking about that. I think probably had to do with age. So I was kind of seen as monoracial, and that was fine. But I knew what my actual background was, and so I kind of thought it was curious when people would make assumptions, and I'd say, "Oh, why did they think that or say that?" And I'd say, "Oh, I see, because they think I'm only, let's say, black," because that's usually what people think when they first see me. But then I think one event that kind of stood out to me, because all of my life growing up, I had a lot of involvement with my Sri Lankan side of the family, and that was just like normal for me. But it really wasn't reflected in my daily school life. So where I lived, already there's probably a relatively small Sri Lankan population in California anyway, but so I went to high school and I remember interacting with a new peer. She was just maybe a year older, a grade, above me. And I remember looking at her and being like, she, like, I know she's South Asian, but I just feel like she has to be Sri Lankan. So I hadn't even met her, but I just introduced myself and I was like, "Hi, excuse me, like, where are your parents from?" And she kind of looked at me like she probably gets that question all the time. And then when she said, I think she said something general to kind of almost get me off her back. And I was like, "Yeah, but like, what country?" And then she was like, "They're from Sri Lanka," probably thinking I would be like, "Oh, where's that?" But I was like, "Oh my God, me too." And then she was like, "What?" Ah! So we had this whole moment. And she's like, "Wait, my brother." And so she like went and found her brother. And so like until this day, we're friends. And so that was a standout moment for me just because it was a moment I realized that I had this whole side of who I was that I really didn't get a chance to engage with on like a peer level. And so I realized, I'm like, oh, I do have this whole side of my life that like no one really else knows about. I can't really talk about it. Maybe they don't understand it too well, but then these two people really did. And so we could join around that.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I think that would be one of the bigger events that happened when I was young.
Mhm.
Mm.
Do you think that people perceiving you as just as being monoracial affected like how you thought about your own mixed identity?
Yeah, I think definitely to a certain extent. I mean, I to this day, I'm deeply connected to both sides, but as far as like daily life in the United States, I'm deeply connected to just African American like culture and everything that goes along with it. Probably because, I was probably assigned to that group and then I just found a lot of belonging there. So, um, and, then it's just, I guess I think people don't realize, but both Sri Lankans and African Americans are very much like into dancing and music and having fun and almost like being loud and boisterous and whatever. So it's like it all sort of fit together. It didn't feel foreign for me at all. So yeah, so I'd say even today, probably, most of my peers and my social circle, it weighs more heavily on African American side, and it has to be influenced by how people saw me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that totally makes sense.
Mhm.
And so going off of that, how have you engaged with the mixed community in the past and in the present?
Yeah, well, if I go backwards a little bit, I think um, when I was in college, that's when I really started like searching out specific things around being mixed race. Like I did sort of a independent kind of project with one of my professors, and then I started digging around and finding like research articles on being mixed race. And I didn't know at that time that people were even looking at that as an experience. So I found an organization that was in Southern California. And so I joined that organization. It was dedicated, it's an organization, they're still around. They're called Multiracial Americans of Southern California. So I joined them as a member and I went to like a couple conferences and I started to learn that, wow, like there's all these different people, parents and children and adults and professors that kind of talk about this experience. And then some years later, I became an officer in that organization, and I worked with them and a whole host of other sort of, I guess, like leaders in that world of trying to help people understand the experience.
Mhm.
So that was definitely where I got involved. And then little by little, I just started to see different needs. So when I was working with this organization, sometimes we get a lot of parents that would say, oh, what should I say to my kid? Or I have a teenager and they're asking me this, what do I do? And so as I got older, I realized, okay, someone needs to meet that need of like helping the parent. Um, and then we would meet so many mixed race adults that would say, my parent never did 1, 2, and 3. So when I put the two together, I was like, okay, I have to try to create something to help them. If I've lived it and I know about it and I'm seeing this need, let me try to create some sort of way to help. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, in the past year or so since when COVID started, I've been working with Mask as like a teen volunteer. So I'm working with a board member and then another volunteer, and we put on some
Oh, that's
like
awesome.
different like teen talks, like they're talks designed for teens. And now we actually have one upcoming in 2 weeks, I think, about intersectionality. So it's been a lot of
Yeah.
fun.
I
Yeah.
get the email, so I didn't know you were behind that. That's
Uh-huh.
great. That's so great.
Yeah, small
Yeah.
world. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, going off of what you just said, what has your experience been like being a psychologist and working with multiracial families, teenagers, and like, what is some typical problems that you might notice a parent of a multiracial person comes to you with, and then how do you what advice or suggestions do you give them?
Um, well, for the parent, yeah, if they come with some questions, it's usually about how do I help my kid, really embrace all of who they are. Because the parent sort of feels like, well, I'm just one person or I'm just one side, and I'm not sure how to help them embrace the other side. And how can I make sure I balance it out so that I give them enough of me and my background and culture, but make sure they have access to the other side. And also, a lot of parents just don't want to miss something, so they know on some level that they're starting to realize, okay, I don't think I understand what my kid is actually going to go through. I thought maybe I did, but now I'm seeing, okay, I won't. So how can I make sure I just stay aware and try to really be like, okay, what is your experience before I try to explain your life to you?
Mhm.
So those are two big ones. And then I think the other piece is about cultural exposure. So I think a lot of parents struggle with how to figure out how to make sure their kid has enough access so that they feel like they are a member of all of the cultures in their background.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. And with multiracial teenagers,
Mhm.
how have you noticed that being mixed race might affect their mental health? Not necessarily in like a like pure like only negative way, but I mean, like just from personal experience, I think it does add another, like being mixed adds another level of like, okay, I'm about to meet, like it's a new, it's a new school year. We just started and it's like, okay, I'm about to be perceived by 7 new teachers, new classmates. How will, when I say my name, when they, call your name out on the
Mhm.
roster and you raise your hand, they give you a look like, oh, like how does
Mhm.
that, like I think experiences like that, I think kind of create some anxiety about
Mhm.
being mixed as just one example. So what have you noticed about that?
Yeah, I think, you know, to your point, I think a lot of younger mixed race folks are kind of just hyper aware of how they're being perceived. And it's sort of like what you're saying. And so it can have a lot of different impacts. On some level, it might make someone feel like, ooh, I'm on stage and like,
Mhm.
okay, I'm ready to be seen and I'm going to tell you what I am.
Mhm.
Um, and I think anybody can have those moments. But then I think for the most part, especially when they're younger and they're not really sure, like, okay, what are these looks? Are they negative looks? Are people staring at me because they don't like it? Um, then there's a feeling of just always being aware of where they are, what they look like, what they're saying, who sees them, who's in the room. And so it's oftentimes navigating how to feel fully just okay with presenting yourself exactly as you are and not having to like explain yourself and shrivel up and kind of hide and kind of not be seen. So I think that's a big piece of the puzzle. And then internally, I think for teens, kind of going back to what I was saying with parents, is that when a teen doesn't feel like they have access to their culture, then they sort of feel weird about claiming some aspect of who they are because maybe they have, since you and I both have a South Asian parent, maybe they have a South Asian parent that's like not that involved or um, isn't very involved in their own community. And so they're like, well, can I really claim that? I never do 1, 2, 3. I don't speak a language. I don't eat this. I've never been there. And so there's a lot of internal kind of battle of like, well, how do I feel like that if I don't know anything about those cultural pieces?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I feel like I relate to the inverse of that, where growing up, and we both do Indian dance, and I think
Yeah.
that was my huge cultural anchor to my South Asian side.
Mhm.
Whereas I felt like it was harder to grasp my whiteness because it was just like American whiteness, not like my my dad's not like a European immigrant with like a who comes with a culture. It's really just the culture that everybody engages in daily. That's just what he has. And so I was all like when I was younger, I would always just say I'm Indian, even though I don't, we're racially ambiguity, not, my name, my last name Yates is not Indian at all. And so I think I was trying to like fit myself into that narrative.
Mhm.
But yeah, so that's it's just, I think it'd be like accepting your true self. And now like as I've grown older and more just like aware of who I am,
Mhm.
I've progressed into like, making sure being proud of my mixedness and making sure people know that I'm mixed and that it's not something to like be ashamed of. But um I've noticed that I have a lot of mixed friends, and
Mhm.
like half of them are pretty open about it, but the other half just kind of go with one side, what they look like, because I think
Wow.
it goes back to what your experience was, as people perceive them as monoracial. And I always found that really interesting, because as somebody who doesn't just present as like one thing or another, it's more difficult for me to just kind of go with that. But it is easier for them to be able to just be monoracial and not really embrace their mixedness. So
Yeah.
um is there like what would you say to somebody who wasn't really embracing their mixedness, wasn't presenting themselves as mixed?
Yeah.
What would you recommend?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a really interesting question because you kind of said two things just now, like not embracing their mixedness, but then also not kind of disclosing that they're mixed to other people. And I
Mhm.
think those are two separate things because I do think, and some of our really famous mixed race researchers write about this too, that if if you choose to identify with one group or one aspect of your background, that's actually okay as long as you are embracing your mixedness on the inside. And so I think I'd want to start there and make sure, like you said, there wasn't really just like maybe some shame or maybe some confusion or like, oh, I don't know, I just don't want to be associated with that, so I'll just go with this. As long as that's not present, then them choosing to identify with one is a perfectly fine choice, um, because we have, as mixed race people, we will probably change the way we identify as our lives go on. So there could have been a time, even for myself, that I might have been more likely to say, like on forums or something, just check one of the boxes, especially when they say just check one. And I'm like, okay, well, fine, whatever, I'll just give you
Yeah.
that box. But then
Mhm.
as time goes on, sort of like, actually, no, I don't even want to play your little box game. So giving someone space to choose what fits with them at the time is really important.
Mhm.
um, but if they're a young person and they're sort of saying, yeah, I'm just whatever, and they're almost hiding something else, that's when I would be concerned. Not concerned, but just like have some red flags, like, oh, that means for you, you have some work to do.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you brought up the checking boxes, and now like in our lifetimes it's changed, where pretty much every form I've been doing standardized tests recently, um and you can choose as many as you want. But when I was in elementary school, and I'm sure for most of your life, that it was just like choose one.
Right.
And then on top of that, like we're both of South Asian heritage, there was never,
Right.
I feel like in the US, Asian, yes, South Asia is in India, but like that's
Yeah.
not, when you ask somebody like, oh, like I would like, are you Asian? They usually think of like East Asia, just
Yeah.
not South Asian. So it was another thing, and it was
Yeah.
a lot of box confusion. But
Yeah, it's
um
true. It's
yeah.
true because I remember even feeling sort of funny, like maybe checking off Asian and being like, well, because even in my mind, I've been trained to think like, oh, it's either China, Japan, Korea, that's it, or something.
Mhm.
Um, I'm sure we could list a lot more, but it's sort of like you have this big picture of what it's supposed to be, and then
Mhm.
you're sort of like, well, can they make another box? Well, no, I actually do fall under that, or even
Yeah.
with friends. Sometimes I've had friends for a long time, and they know, let's say they've met my parents or they know my family or something like that, and then I'll say, well, being Asian, something, something. You're not Asian. And I'm like,
Mhm.
yes, yeah. I'm like, don't you remember? This is my parent is from here. And then they're like, is that Asian? I'm like, yes, it falls under that. And then they have
Yeah.
this whole moment because in their mind, they're like, but you're not Chinese, you know? So it's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
And then you may have touched on this, but was there ever a time when you were like in your teens that you deliberately chose to identify as like one thing over the other? And like, and then in general, like what advice, if you could go back to your younger self, would you give regarding your identity?
I don't think I deliberately identified as one. It was more like a default, if
Mhm.
you will. Like I said, it was sort of like people already see me this way. And so I sort of was thinking, well, since they see me that way and it's still true, I'll just go ahead and go with that rather than like complicating things or, not filling it out and having to have a whole talk about why did I leave this 5 question, box thing empty. So I think it was more like that. And I guess the advice I would give myself is maybe being a little bit more, vocal about some of that stuff earlier on. Probably not before 12 years old. I mean, I don't know what I was
Yeah.
thinking before that age. But certainly in high school, I probably could have. I know I was mostly pretty vocal around my peers, but probably in more of my schoolwork and paperwork and even forms and things, I probably could have had some encouragement to kind of be a little bit more open about that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
And I think our last question can be, how would you describe mixed race or even your multiracial identity in doesn't have to be any in a condensed format?
Okay. Well, I did think about that. And I remember a long time ago, well, a couple years ago, I was speaking at, I think it was UCLA. And so I just came up with a little phrase of being authentically any, all, whenever, and always. Because, being mixed race, people are like, well, which one are you? And, oh, I thought, last year you said you were this. And so I liked those words, like, any of my backgrounds, all of my backgrounds. And then whenever I want, I can assert whichever one. And then I'm always all of them. So it doesn't matter. And so that way you can sort of be authentic. So those are my choice words there.
Mhm. Yeah, I really like that. Could you repeat it one more time?
Sure. Being authentically any, all, whenever, and always.
Okay, yeah, I really like that. Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm really excited that we could have this conversation and for future conversations.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having this. Was fun.
Mhm.